Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here for this special evening. It's really I feel like it was just about 2 weeks ago that we got confirmation from Mr. Israel Starck that he would be able to come and speak with us over here and have this conversation that we're having tonight. And in less than 2 weeks, we have a full overflow crowd over here, so I feel like it's just testament to how important tonight's evening is. So I don't want to take any of your time. We want to listen to Reb Izzy as much as we can. So I'd like to just give a few thank yous and acknowledgments, and then we will begin. I'd like to start by, again, thanking all of you for being here. It's important and special and meaningful to have you all here for this important discussion and conversation. I'd like to give a big thank you to Mr. Thomas Zoles and his wife Darcy and their son Hugo, who's joining us here tonight, for being the hosts of tonight's evening, the owners of Pianoforte. So really a big thank you to Thomas and Darcy for hosting us here tonight. He already had a meeting scheduled, but he canceled it to be here, or pushed it off. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Alderman Pat Dowell from the 3rd Ward. I got it right this time. Well, with the remap, it's still, no, just kidding. Acknowledge the presence of Alderman Dowell, as well as the presence of Sergeant Fleming and Sergeant Galassi from the 1st District, who keep us safe every day, day in, day out. So thank you for being here. I'd like to also acknowledge Alderman Baron Sixto Lopez of the 25th Ward, who is supposed to be here tonight and will be here hopefully later during the reception. And a thank you to my wife for all the tremendous amount of work and hours that she put into tonight's evening. And last but not least, Achrein Chaviv, the most important thank you of tonight is to Mr. Israel Starck, Reb Izzy, as we call him, and his wife and granddaughter, who are here to share his story and to inspire us tonight. So really a big thank you for being here tonight. In just a moment, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Thomas Zoles, who will be moderating tonight's discussion. Alongside, we're going to have a few others from the community and from the audience who will join the discussion throughout the evening. We have Ali Stone, who is the owner of Studio Chicago down the street and is the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. Her mother, who is the child of a survivor, is actually here with us, who drove in from Madison, Wisconsin. We also have Stella Berkelhammer, who is also a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. Both of her father's parents were survivors of the Holocaust, and she will also be joining the discussion tonight. And then we also have Lily Davidson, who will also be joining the discussion tonight, and we're honored to have you all as part of tonight's program. There will be open Q&A at the end of the program as well, but this is just part of the formal program. One last thing. As soon as I hand over to Thomas, he's going to take it over. You won't hear too much from me anymore. But after the program, there will be Q&A. You'll have an opportunity to get Reb Izzy's book, and there will be a reception in the back, informal reception, where you'll be able to discuss, individually and, chat with others about tonight. Without further ado, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Mordecai. So I'm Thomas Zoles, and I'd like to welcome you all very warmly to Pianoforte. If you're wondering where you are, you're in a 1906 building that was part of Motor Row. They made automobile parts in this building. It was a little factory. They later made bicycle parts, and then the building was fallow for many years, and we turned it into the Pianoforte Studios, as we call them, which is everything dedicated to the piano and music made with the piano. So here you're in our performance and recording studio. Upstairs we have a showroom, and that's who we are. I also wanted to mention that I am the son of a victim. My mother was a Kindertransport child from Vienna to London. Her father went through the camps, Dachau and Buchenwald, and when he came out, he went to England and joined the army with the Jewish Corps, and so when I read this incredible book that we're going to hear about, I was very moved and very connected to it. So thank you, Mr. Starck, and without further ado, please.
Thank you very, very much. First of all, I would like to apologize to you that I'm sitting down. In the past, when I was a little younger, I used to stand up by a platform and usually speak from a platform. But as age advances, I have to sit, or I should sit. And thank you very much for allowing me to do that. I wish to express a heartfelt thanks, first of all, to Rabbi Mordechai and Moshki Gershon, and to Alderman Duval, and to Sergeant Fleming and Galassi, and of course to my friend here sitting beside me, Thomas Zoll, and the Mother Ray attending this evening. I also would like at this moment also to welcome my wife Ethel and my granddaughter Yoli. My wife Ethel usually doesn't accompany me to these lectures, but this time I think I'm glad that she's here and I appreciate it. Also, first of all, before I really begin, I would like to also take a moment and thank the Almighty God, and as we say in Shevach, give a Shevach v'hoidua, which is in Hebrew, a thankful to Almighty that He allowed me to reach to this point, and I'm still able to come and sit down and tell you about my experiences in the past. Thank you again for allowing your community also to attend my presentation about the tragedy and the Holocaust, which occurred approximately only 90 years ago during the Second World War. Why have I been speaking publicly about this for so many years now? Because you represent the parents of future generations. We proclaim in Hebrew, Zechor. Zechor means to remember. We cannot and must not even forget this very tragic period of world history. The torch will be passed to you. I and all the others who endured that regretfully, there are fewer and fewer first-hand eyewitnesses still present who can stand before any assembly or as I'm sitting before you and share what I witnessed. What I'm about to tell you isn't tales from some published articles or something I heard from my grandfather or my parents. I would like to just shortly give you a little bit information about my plan this evening. I plan to give you a synopsis of my 4 year of my struggle in 4 different concentration camps. And after hopefully there'll be time left, I would like to entertain some questions and answers. I really always welcome questions because I learn very much how you think about this terrible Shoah that occurred approximately 75 or 80 years ago. But rather, these are trials and tribulations witnessed personally by me and experienced as a boy of just 14 years old. A brief history of my family and background, I want to give you that. I was born in the eastern part, the eastern part of Czechoslovakia, of the Czech Republic, known also as Karpato-Rus, into a very religious Orthodox Jewish family. I was the only male child with 3 sisters. Many refer to me in Hebrew as a Ben Yachid, the only boy. When Hitler decided to physically occupy the Czech Republic in 1939, the territory of Karpato-Rus, which is where I was born, reverted back to control of the Hungarian Empire. Until then, it had belonged to the Czech Republic. Once it reverted back to the Hungarian kingdom, conditions for the Jews changed drastically. Hitler made a deal with the Hungarian king, Horthy Miklós was his name, that they will not physically occupy Hungary just like they marched into Czechoslovakia and Poland later on and so forth. But Hungary should sort of toe their line and follow their edicts against, of course, the first thing was to give the Jews, come out against different type of laws against the Jews of Hungary. And also, they took away our licenses, let's say, from different professional people like doctors, druggists, and teachers, and professors, and so forth. They took away the license, and they wouldn't let them practice their profession. So the Hungarians certainly, but nevertheless, in spite of all that, we were able to every evening go and back to sleep in our own beds. In spite of the fact that maybe many, many times I myself as a little boy went to sleep with terrible hunger pains, and of course so many other hundreds and thousands of other children, because it was very, very difficult to make a living and so forth. But nevertheless, the most positive thing still occurred, that we were still in our homes. They did not transport us out of our homes. From approximately 1940 to 1944, these new circumstances created tremendous hardships for us, but we were still, during that period of time, able to continue, as I mentioned, living in our homes. However, in the spring of 1944, even this remnant of normal life evaporated when the German forces marched into Hungary, occupying our towns and even our homes. Eventually, right as history will tell you, the Germans also occupied Hungary. Once the Germans occupied Hungary, of course, things have changed for the Jews drastically. As a matter of fact, there was the morning of following Passover in 1944, there was a knock on the door, and 4 gendarmes, Hungarian gendarmes with the German officers were standing there, and they gave us the following command, the following instructions, and they said to my parents that you have 1 hour to pack whatever you can carry, and report in the backyard of the synagogue, which was very close to us. It was about maybe 3 or 4 homes away, and report there. And of course, my friends when you're told to, you have 1 hour to pack and take whatever you can carry, it was the morning after Passover, as I mentioned. There was still no food in our house. There was almost no food at all during the entire holiday of Passover. But my mother pulled out a big bed sheet and she started throwing in articles of clothing. And finally she bundled up, and of course we all did what we were instructed. We reported to the backyard of that synagogue. As I mentioned before, I had come from a very religious family. My father was a Hasidic person, and I had 3 sisters, and I was the only son, the only boy, as I mentioned before. And after my sisters, who were still that morning also in the apartment, they heard that the instructions that we have to pack in whatever we can carry and report in the backyard of the synagogue. They decided to run away through the backyard and through a window that we faced a forest area. Of course, once we arrived to this to the backyard of the synagogue, and my parents realized that my sisters were not present, they were very distraught and very downhearted. And of course, and nobody of us knew what happened to them. But after about 2 or 3 hours from a distance, I told my parents, told my mother, don't cry anymore, my sisters are approaching. And of course they approached us and they said, there's no place to hide, there's no help that we can get from anybody, and whatever will happen to you will happen to us. Sure enough, after shortly they counted us over and over again, and eventually they marched us into a temporary ghetto. Temporary ghetto was a brick factory, which at that time that they marched us in was not in operation. They did not have any of the firing of the bricks at that time. And they housed us there in that factory. The reason, again, why they picked this ghetto, this brick factory, because the freight cars could come in right into the factory, and they had a siding there and so forth. They wouldn't have to transport us out and load us out in some station. So that was all figured out. They always had their planning was always perfect. So they, again, I don't really remember whether it was 2 weeks or less or more being in that ghetto that I just described to you, in the brick factory. But after a while, again, the command came everybody to line up again, men, women, and children. We all lined up by the platform where the freight cars were standing, and this time they told us that they are going to be taken to some Hungarian farms to do some work in these farms, and we should not worry about every family will be together, and that we should willingly and peacefully go into these. They load us up in those freight cars. Usually those freight cars would, I think 50, 60 people maybe would already be overcrowded, but they pushed in sometimes between 70 and 90 people to these. Many times people that were sitting couldn't get up, and people that were standing couldn't sit down. And of course, after a while, the train started moving out, and as you will see in my book, I have the cover here. May I have it? Here, the cover has that little rectangular where it says where my number is. But this was actually every freight car, every freight car, cattle car had this narrow rectangular window. That was the only opening in these freight cars. So they picked me up and they told me to put my head out, because the train that was the freight train, that those cattle cars that were carrying us, that was moving forward, and when it came to some important station, they had to slow down. And they asked me to call up the name of the station, and I did this. And passing by 2 or 3 stations, I could see on the faces of my parents and also the people in that cars, and that cattle cars, that we are not moving to some Hungarian farms, but we are moving to Auschwitz. Sure enough, I think the train this time slowed down a little more than usual. And again, they lifted me up, and I put my head out, and I said, it seems to me that this is the final destination, because I see, first of all, a sign, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, a gate. And then I also announced that I see a big platform beside the train, loaded with all kinds of bundles and suitcases and so forth. So I knew that would be our last destination. But something happens there which saved my life, and I have to take a few moments to tell you about it. Everybody, as the train stopped, came to a full stop, the command aussteigen was reverberating all over. Aussteigen in German means to disembark from those cattle cars. Everybody started to get off, including my sisters and all our friends that were on the same car. But my mother motioned not to hurry, not to stay. And sure enough, I listened to her, and I looked around. Soon I looked around a few minutes later, and I see there were 3 people standing in that empty freight car. It was my father and my mother and myself. My mother called me over, and she opened up that bundle that she had, and she started putting on articles of clothing on me, different articles, another sweater, another shirt, and another pair of slacks. And I asked her mother, why are you doing this? And she told me, she says, you see this platform, you see everything we have to leave over there. We cannot take anything with us. So just what you have on your person, you may be able to keep. Sure enough, this young man that was in charge of these arrivals, these transports at that time, he had to make sure that everybody disembarked, like he announced. But this time he passed by and he saw 3 people did not listen to him. And this was my parents. And finally he got very angry, and he told my mother, you were told to get off. Why aren't you listening? Why are you still there? And my mother says, okay, we are going to get off in a minute. He proceeded to check another 2 or 3 cattle cars in front of us. But then he decided that he must make sure that we listen to him. This time he came up on instead of giving us a lecture, this time he came up, and he told my mother, stop doing this. He will not be needing all this. He says, stop doing that. And finally she stopped, and finally he looked at me and he says, little boy, in Yiddish, in Jewish, he said, little boy, how old are you? And I said, I am 14. And he looks at me, he says, no, you are not 14. From now on, remember, you are 18. I was a fresh little boy, and I started arguing with him. And I said, why should I be 18 if I'm 14? Finally, in order to make a point, he took his finger and bordered my chest. And he says, little boy, he says, in Yiddish, he says, Yingele, he says, here you do not ask any questions. If I tell you you're 18, that you are 18. Remember that. And now get off. This is the last time I saw my mother. I never saw her again. And of course, sure enough, we went off, and I was still together with my father. And pretty soon they lined us up, and they counted us over and over again, and they started marching us towards Birkenau, which was the camp in Auschwitz that housed us. And but before that, before we got there, we arrived to like a tremendous airplane hangar, where there were prisoners with hair clippers cutting everybody's hair. There we had to give up everything. We had to undress, and I was standing naked. And as these so-called barbers were clipping our hair, I was very curious boy, and I approached one and says, please tell us what is going to happen here? What is going to happen to us? And he wouldn't speak. Nobody would answer. No one would answer me. Finally, I went from one to the other. Finally, one said, turn around this way, and I turned around the other way, that I shouldn't face him. And he says, you see this clothing, these prison clothing that's laid out on that table over there? Pretty soon they're going to give it to you, and from now on your struggle is going to begin. And sure enough, he was right. After that, we got those prison clothing, and we finally brought us into Birkenau, which is part of Auschwitz. We were sitting around there. Usually, they were either, sometimes they had, many times, they appointed prisoners to certain type of work, whether it was in coal mines or in other type of work. But this time we were sitting around for about a week, maybe a week and a half. I don't remember the exact time. And they just counted us every day. Eventually they loaded us up again into freight cars, and this time, again, the train started going, and this time we ended up in a second concentration camp called Mauthausen. Mauthausen was a terrible, terrible camp. I mean, it's hard to describe what kind of a place this was, but nevertheless, in this particular camp, Mauthausen was a distribution center to many different camps, satellite camps around that area, where people were busy, those prisoners were busy to work and help as much for the German Reich or for the war effort of the German Reich in that time. And of course, as long as they could squeeze out the last drop of blood from or breath from these prisoners, were fine. Eventually, they all ended up in smoke. So that was Mauthausen. Also there, unfortunately, I was separated with my father by accident. And also in Mauthausen, they handed me that a little rectangular little cloth, a little piece of cloth with a number written on there, 68818. And the prisoner who handed me says, "Little boy, this is going to be your name now, 68818." And sure it was. As many times when, if later on, if they wanted to refer to me or call me for some reason, usually it wasn't a good sign when they did call you, they used to call prisoner 68818, would you report? So, and as I'm mentioned, unfortunately, I separated from my father over there, and we landed in the third camp, which was called Melk. Melk was in Austria, not far from Vienna, and Melk already is the camp where they put us to work, where I got my permanent job, but I describe in the book that what I happened to have in Melk called the Spitzenträger, the carrier of the pointers. The pointers that I'm referring to is because we as prisoners in Melk worked in a mountain in building tunnels with air hammers, and those air hammers had certain steel pointers in there which had to be sharpened from time to time, but they couldn't be sharpened inside the tunnels because it would consume the oxygen. So there was a blacksmith outside, and my job was to carry the dull ones to the blacksmith to sharpen them and bring back the sharp ones into the tunnel and distribute it to those prisoners. There was one tremendous advantage that I had because I had access to fire, being a friend of this blacksmith now. So if anybody found a rotten tomato or an old bone, he brought it to me, and since I singed it in the fire, it was a little tastier. After all this in Melk, of course, they finally, sure enough, the Russian army was approaching Vienna and Melk. We were marched to Ebensee in Austria near Linz, which was the fourth and final camp. We must have arrived there about the middle of March, 1945, just a small remnant of the hundreds that started the trip. About maybe 500 of us or more arrived. In Ebensee, we were not assigned to any type of work detail, but we were also not given the daily portion of the so-called bread. Suddenly, one morning, which must have been on May the 6th or the 7th, I noticed that the guard towers surrounding the camp were no longer occupied by SS Army personnel with machine guns, maybe, Just maybe liberation was at hand. I said to my friends, soon the sounds of artillery confirmed this, and I elected to stand with my friends at the gates to welcome our liberators, which were the American Fifth Army. My dear friends, the saga of liberation is in itself a most important episode. And I can speak about just liberation for hours. Food, food, give us food was the unanimous call of all the prisoners. Sure enough, the American liberators brought in an army field kitchen and dished out a concoction of rice with fat bacon. I can assure you that at that moment, I and my friends would have gladly given our lives in exchange even for just a loaf of bread. Somebody would have offered me a loaf of bread and say, Starck, here, eat as much as you can, but as a price you will be hanged or shot tomorrow morning. I would have gladly made that deal. And so would my friends. So why did I urge my friends not to join the line to partake in this dish out that the Americans cooked up? Something about the smell made me nauseous, and subsequently we saw as people began gobbling up this concoction, this food, they died on the spot. The reason my friends turned to me and says, Starck, are you sure that the Americans are not poisoning us? And I said, impossible. But nevertheless, the reason why they died on the spot after gobbling up that food is because the digestive system was so shrunk, and once they took it in, it just like exploded, and their I would say, whole digestive system, and they died. So eventually my Americans realized that this is not a very good idea. Finally, they stopped dishing out that particular concussion, and later on they told us in another 2 hours we'll have another field kitchen coming in, and this time, sure enough, a field kitchen showed up, and this time they started giving us powdered milk with farina and oatmeal, which our digestive system could tolerate. Eventually, also the army, the American army, of course, brought in field hospitals and medication for the sick, and certainly were very helpful in bring us back to some normal life. I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to just mention that may the memory of these heroes that I have spoken about, may they all inspire us in future generations that we should remember and not forget. Thank you very much, and I would like now to open up for questions, because I really would welcome some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a first question, and that is, how did you get your number, and why is there a red triangle next to it?
Okay, as I mentioned, the number was given to me on that little piece of cloth in Mauthausen, which was the second camp. The reason why there was a red triangle on there rather than because Jewish prisoners usually got a yellow triangle, or they got the Star of David on there. So the reason for this was because they we and many of my friends and many of that came from our area, from our part of Hungary, many of these prisoners that they selected for work, like they selected me when I was standing in line, and the first question was how old I am, and kannst du arbeiten, can I work? And I immediately came to me the word, the thought of the young man, I could see him in front of me and say 18. So I said 18, and therefore saved my life. But usually these, because later on I learned, I asked the same question. And later on, I learned from Israel, but they have over there about the Shoah and Yad Vashem. I learned from them that there was negotiations going on between Eichmann and Hungarian leadership if they can come up with $100 million, which would be trucks and coffee and soap and chocolate and all different things. They would release 125,000 Hungarian prisoners. And Eichmann gave that command that 125,000 Hungarian prisoners should not be tattooed, but should be only given numbers with the red triangles, and I was one of them.
Incredible.
Any other questions? Of course, I would like to hear of your questions. Don't be
I
bashful.
I have another question.
Yes.
So I just met you literally 10 minutes before 7, and I already feel like we're friends. And it struck me in your book that wherever you go, you instantly make friends. Do you think that has, and I mean, they're not always the same people, I should add, because you were moved around a lot, and you get to a new place, and right away you have a whole cohort of friends, and you're kind of like the quiet leader of the pack, and you stick together. Do you think that has something to do
I will tell you,
with while
I
you're
think
here?
you hit something here on a nail on the head, but because I'll tell you, I have had many friends that also were, of course, went through the I call it the Churban Europe or the Shoah, the same as I, but each one was different. First of all, you have to realize, my friends, that I am not unique. Anybody who went through this particular time and many different concentration camps, each one can write a book on its own. I am not unique about that. But nevertheless, I was fortunate that when I was liberated and I came to Chicago, I met a very group. I lived in Hyde Park near the University of Chicago, met some very good friends, and also that I was able to speak about my experiences. It was never, I met so many different survivors that were unable to speak about it, or maybe they just wouldn't even think about it, maybe. And they also, many told me that they had some terrible dreams occurring of some things that I witnessed. There are many things I witnessed that I'm not going to speak about it. But nevertheless, I feel very fortunate that I was able to speak about it, and therefore I made friends immediately after my arrival. I was 17, 18 years old when I arrived in Chicago, and it was very easy for me to make friends, which many of them are still around.
Wonderful. Do you think it also has something to do with your upbringing? It seemed like the area, Carpato Rus, where you were, was very unique. A lot of faith, and also in a way maybe protected because there were not so many pogroms and things like that.
I think that I must say that you're really right. It had to be something in my upbringing. Look here. The city where I come from, where I was born, Mukachevo, which is in Carpato Rus. Right now, it is a city in Ukraine, under the Ukrainian thing. It's a very beautiful city. When I was a young boy over there, and I would say the majority of the population of the city, the population numbered probably close to around 18,000, but I would say about maybe 80 or 85% were Jews. And of course, there were different homes and so forth, but many people tell me, how come you survived? What was it that was able you to survive in the struggles that we faced? And I say, well, first of all, the reason, I would say, in my own opinion, The main reason because I believed in God. I believed, and I was still talking about, and many of the prisoners in Milk came to me and said, my nickname was Srulik. They came to me and said, Srulik, why are you trying to encourage us to survive? Can't you see what's going on? And don't you just turn your back. You see the pile over there in front of the crematorium? We're all going to end up over there. We're all going to go up and smoke. Why struggle another month? Why struggle another week? So forth. When prisoners who were my friends, many of them were my friends, came and told me and really argued with me about this point about why encourage them to survive and why should they struggle, I was very sad because that was the moment that prisoner gave up. And giving up was actually a death sentence because there was no need to, as I said, many did not want us to go on and could suffer those hunger pains and struggle every day to survive. But my only answer was that I am not a prophet. I don't have any communication from the Almighty. But I know one thing, that war is going on, and I know the other thing that you should also know, that the time that they transported the Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, as far as the Germans were concerned, the war was lost. The war was lost way before that. The war was lost in Stalingrad when they had actually sadly the worst conditions there that the German army suffered. So that was the time when the war was lost already. So I said, I know only one thing. There's a war going on. I don't know what's going on. I don't know who's winning and who's losing. But I feel that it must be that the Germans are losing because they were already losing when they took us away. So if you can only hold out, please do so. But also the other part is, yes, my upbringing in home, the religious upbringing from my parents and so forth, did help me very much to survive.
Thank you. I'd like to take some questions, if that's okay.
I would welcome it.
I think Ali, you had a
Raise your
question.
hand if
Ali
you have a
Stone.
question.
We'll need a mic. Oh yeah, please, if you can come up here, that would be best.
How are you? Thank you so much for being here and for giving us your time and sharing your story. Wasn't that on? You guys can hear me? Let's try now. Okay, perfect. Thank you for being here and for giving us your time and sharing your story. It's really an honor to sit in the same room and hear what you have to say. I have two questions I was hoping to ask you. First, as a young Jewish person concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism, do you think this is something that could happen again? And how, as the Jewish community and allies to the Jewish community, can we best stand up for each other and prevent another Shoah?
Well, the first question was whether something like this could happen again, right? What was the second question?
How, as the Jewish community and allies to the Jewish community, can we best stand up for one another?
Well, the answer to the first question is, yes, I certainly believe. The reason why I am talking about it to so many different educational groups, different schools, different organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, because it is important to remember, and I'm trying to only get through one thing. Please, anybody I'm speaking to, especially in children, I spoke 2 days ago in the Lincolnshire School in Lincoln. Where is the Lincolnshire School located? In
Lincolnshire?
Yeah, it's yeah. Do you know this school is like a city? It has close to 6,000 students, and I spoke not for 6,000 students. I spoke for about 400 of them. And I'll tell you, I pointed out to them, they're the future generations. They're the fathers and mothers of future generations. And it's very, very important for them to remember and to tell their children, their offspring, that what took place not in 2,000 years ago, not 2,500 years ago, but only about 75, 80 years ago. And yet, I don't know, you see the news, you read the papers, you see what happened in Uganda, what happened in some other places. There were in Sudan. I mean, life doesn't mean anything. And just because the whole thing, because you happen to be of a different race, of a different religion, so yes, it can very easily happen again because history has a tendency to repeat itself. Now I forgot about your second question.
I mean, you partially answered it, but how, in your opinion, how as the Jewish community and allies to the Jewish community can we best stand up for one another beyond sharing our stories, your stories, to future generations?
The answer is that what I've been doing is just for that purpose, for that reason. Is I'm trying to put through my feelings, and also then tell people, please be on guard, tell young children be on guard, because yes, history can repeat itself and can happen again. Any other questions? Yeah, there's somebody in the back there.
Can you pass the mic?
I call you Srulik?
Yes.
Srulik,
Yes.
one of my beacons in life is Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl, the child psychiatrist who talks a lot about the fact that...
You read his book?
I did.
Okay.
But he's written about 27 books, but
Right.
the meaning of life. He talks about the fact that he experienced directly, and that became the essence of his logotherapy, that he noticed that people that had something that they looked forward to survived. People that looked backward tended to not survive.
Are you referring to in camps, in the concentration camps?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Well, I think, first of all, I don't compare myself to Viktor Frankl, who was his work, such important work as a psychologist, I believe, to point out exactly what we have to be on guard for and be in guard against thing. And I think that basically when you say looking backwards, in the concentration camp itself, whether it was in the first one, anytime, any prisoner, he was busy only with one thing, day and night, busy only with one thing. How am I going to survive another week and another day? How am I going to still my hunger pains? That is the worst thing was the hunger pains. Work was actually sometimes depends on your luck. Sometimes you were appointed to work which was not too, I think, very, very heavy type of work, like carrying railroad sidings. Or some prisoners were also working in wood factories, and also some in other clothing factories or shoe factories, so which was not so bad. But nevertheless, none of us, no prisoner, nobody that was in any of these camps got any diet that would sustain him and instill his hunger. So that was the biggest problem, and so forth. So actually, we did not. The only way of looking back was to try. Many times we sat down with my friends and tried to recall the wonderful food that was served on a Saturday by my parents, or on a special Jewish holiday, or so forth, and always thinking that maybe. Also, I will tell you something. Give you one more pointer, that when we were issued our portion of bread, so-called bread, the bread was made from bean flours and sawdust. I think that was the bread that was made. And then sometimes it was divided into 6 portions, sometimes into 8 portions. Some prisoners have put it in their pocket, and every hour got another little morsel and swallowed it. Maybe the taste of something. But I was of a different opinion. I immediately wanted to have, at least I would feel, maybe I'll have 2 or 3 swallows that I feel. So I ate it up, but also there's a terrible thing that I witnessed sometimes at night. I mean, when I couldn't sleep on my bunk, and one time I saw a son approaching his father's jacket and stealing out a little piece of bread that he put away there, which was a terrible thing for me to witness. So I'm saying, yes, looking back was not the issue. What are we going to accomplish looking back except trying to reminiscing what we ate when we were able to actually be at home. So, and as far as the future was concerned, nobody knew what the future brings because we didn't have any news. We didn't have any paper, we didn't have any pencils, we didn't have any watches, we didn't have any nothing. We only knew when we knew when morning was, when the sun came up, and when the sun went down, and so forth. But nevertheless, sometimes I personally, as a young boy who was busy with a blacksmith and many other people that I met that came to me to do some favors that I was able to do, many times I try to encourage them, as I mentioned before, to look forward, and maybe just maybe we will be survive, we will be saved. But otherwise, to look backwards, there was only for that reason or other to try to still our hungers by memory, and to look forward to, there was impossible to really get any factual news what's going on, and based on that. So we were just like had to from day to day, from night to night, whatever occurred, was just only one thing, one thought went through our mind: how are we going to survive next day? Thank you. Any other questions?
If I can jump in, I had one.
Yeah.
You talk about your experience, your suffering being 4 years, and I think...
No, I'm sorry, not 4 years, 4 camps.
Okay. So my question, though, is May 6 or 7, 1945, it wasn't immediately over. What happened afterwards was very complicated and frightening and difficult, I think, until you got here, and maybe even after, I don't know. Do you want to say something about that?
I will tell you something. This is a very, very good question. Why? I believe you remember that I mentioned before that I can speak of liberation for hours, okay? Why can I speak of liberation for hours? Because at the time, when I mentioned the American liberators gave us some food and our hunger pains were stilled, now we started thinking, hey, what happened here? What happened to us? Where's my father? Where's my brother? Where's my sister? Where's my uncle Moshe? I mean, up till then, we were too busy thinking about it. But at the moment of liberation, suddenly we started thinking, we started taking inventory, so to speak, and started to realize the enormity of the Shoah, the enormity of the Korban, as I call it. So many people acted in different ways. Some were said, well, I have to find out who survived, but there was no telephones, my friend. There was no communication. There was no transportation. You couldn't get a bus or a plane or a train. Everything was bombed out. Everything was destroyed. The only thing that was moving was some Russian trains moving to so-called. They were saying they're moving to the Japanese front or something. Anyhow, only military transports were moving very, very slowly, because also the many places the rails were bumped out and so forth. So consequently, it was very, very difficult to find out what is going on. So everybody more or less, and I'm saying everybody, made one decision. In order for me to get answers to my questions, I have to go back home. I have to go back home, and therefore maybe over there I'll find out, because my uncle Izzy or my brother or sister would also feel the same way. I cannot find out. I cannot get a telephone call and say, "Hey, where are you? Are you okay?" The only way to find out if they will also show up, then I know they survived. And this is exactly what happened to my two sisters. Thank God they survived, and they showed up after about 3-4 weeks after I did. So consequently, the only way everybody that was standing liberated, the only way, only the final decision was, in order for me to find out whether who survived and who didn't, is for me to get back to my birthplace. And this is exactly what most of them did. And going back to once we got back, of course, things started normalizing. We started already, getting back to more or less normal life and so forth. And some boy met girl, and girl met a boy, and there was weddings, and there was already life started. Okay, so that was only after return, but the return itself, whether it was from any camp that you go down, there is I'm sure there is a whole history of all the liberated camps. How many of there? Where was their location in Germany or in Austria and so forth, or in Czechoslovakia? So therefore, you can find out all these camps basically only. How am I going to find my way back? Because, as I said, there was no normal transportation. But somehow, if somebody had the urge to go back, like you find sometimes, what is it, salmon that go back to their original spawning, right. Yeah. So consequently, we had to go back to, and by hook or by crook, which is, I can tell you different stories about, but that's not necessary, how we got back. But nevertheless, everybody somehow got back and eventually found out who survived and who didn't.
More questions?
Yes.
Could you just share a little bit about your arrival in Hyde Park? What sort of train of events led you to Chicago? And when you arrived there, what kind of community did you find? And how did that community deal collectively with the grief?
Okay, that's a very good question. First of all, I want to tell you that in my mind, I had absolutely no plan to ever travel and settle in America. I was, so to speak, in my young age, even though I did not have any training as such as a Zionist as a young boy. Nevertheless, after the war, I was only on one opinion. There's only one place for everybody that went through this ordeal and is a survivor. There's only one place for us to go, and this to Israel. And I have been one of the young boys who constantly went around, again, trying to convince people that this is the only way for us to go back to Israel, and the only place, a destination for us. Unknown to me, I was in a DP camp in a kibbutz, so-called kibbutz, where they were supposed to send me to Israel through Aliyah Bet. Aliyah Bet means there was no legal way to go to Israel because the British would not issue any certificates or anybody to come in. So there was only going through illegal ways to different ships and so forth. As a matter of fact, many of you may have read the story of the Exodus, which is also partly describes how people were trying to reach the shores of Israel. But unknown to me, my sisters saw a sign that any boy that survived the war after between the age of 15 and 18 is eligible to go to America. And the one who's sponsoring the trip to America is Mrs. Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt, that was the president's wife, of course. She issued about 500 affidavits for young men to come into to America. My sisters, without telling me anything, put down my name, and registered me to come to America, and didn't tell me a thing. I was in that kibbutz for months, almost for 2 years, and I kept on asking, when are you going to send me to Aliyah Bet, which means the illegal way to Israel. I would like to go. I'm entitled to go already. And each time they kept postponing me because they wanted me. I was a very good influence in that kibbutz. So I reached a point suddenly where I was so depressed and I was so angry. Then suddenly I get a letter, hey, Israel Starck, you have 3 days to appear in Bremerhaven to go to America. I suddenly just like fell down from the sky, and I says, go to America? I said, there must be destiny. Anyhow, how did they know about me? My friends, I suddenly decided if I want to go to Israel, I can go even from America. I will tell you something. I have now, thank God, 4 children that made Aliyah. I have 7 children. 4 of them made Aliyah and live in Israel. 2 live in Chicago and 1 in New Jersey. So basically, I have my roots in Israel, and of course, I do go. Me and my wife do go very often. In fact, we had planned to go in about 2 or 3 weeks again and see my grandchildren. I cannot tell you because I don't count how many grandchildren and great-grandchildren God has granted me. Thank you. Any other question? If I have time, I am in no hurry.
Stella, who is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors as well, is going to ask a question. Just make sure the mic is on.
Okay, come up to the mic. It's on.
Excuse me, I quite didn't finish the question before. Yes, I did get, when I got to Chicago, I did come to Hyde Park, and I was there. I lived right next to University of Chicago, and we were under the auspices of the Joint Jewish Federation, and also called a section the Jewish Children's Bureau. They told us when we arrived in Chicago, I say us, we were about 5 or 6 who arrived in Chicago under the affidavits from the same time, and they told us that they would anything we want. We want to go to college. We want to go to medical school. We want to become shoemakers. We want to become tailors. They will sponsor us. So basically, but I very, very soon decided that I don't need their sponsorship. And I started making some money by becoming a good humor man. I started selling good humor ice cream and bicycle. And eventually, I got into I would say between friends, a group of friends who were part of the University of Chicago students and also religious students who still have believed in God and didn't give up their religion that they were again brought up with from their parents, from their teachers, and so forth. So it was a very, very good time. And finally, about I arrived in 1948. In 1957, I decided it's time for me to get married, and that's when I met my wife, and I got married in that year. Yes.
Please.
So I have 2 questions. My first question is, what did it feel like to wake up? Like, what were your emotions when it felt when you were waking up in a concentration camp every day?
My emotions are when I think of the concentration camps.
When you woke up in the morning.
In
the camp.
In the camp. Oh, when again, I'll tell you. We were very fortunate because, as I mentioned before, and you find it in my book, that we are a group of about 7, 8 boys my age in the camps, and we gave tremendous amount of support to each other. By saying a tremendous amount of support, for instance, we got up about maybe half an hour before the time to get up. There was no showers, but there was running water. Running cold water. So all of the 7 of us came, many mornings came to the washroom. We undressed we took off our shirts, and each one rubbed each other with sand and cold water to invigorate us and so forth. And that actually was part of trying somehow to feel that we should not give up. And this is many of the older prisoners noticed that and in many ways try to really envy. They're envying us that we are certainly not giving up and we are trying to do things which again encouraged us. So getting up in the morning, that was the first thing many times, while other prisoners got up in the morning and say, oh, we are going to get now a portion of so-called hot tea. Actually, it was a soup. The soup was some hot water with caraway seeds in it. That was the soup that we got in the morning as breakfast. So everybody figured, well, I got to line up and I got to get as much as possible to swallow that soup. We figured we'll eventually get there, but I'll also tell you that as young boys, being 15, 16, 17 years old, the Block Elster that we were, I say Block Elster, we all had barracks, and each barrack had a certain number. And each barrack also had called a head of the block, which usually was either a homosexual or a gypsy or a German fellow. There was a prisoner. There were German prisoners also, but they were usually sometimes in many of the barracks. They were terrible. They sort of were towing the line of the SS, and the more people they killed, the probably more favors they got. Fortunately, we got one, which his name was Fritz, and Fritz was very good to us, especially to younger boys. Many times there was a little of that caraway soup left in the kettle. He lined us up again and gave us a second portion. So that was the morning. Every morning, everybody else was looking forward to get that little soup so he can go on, and that was it.
My second question, what are the strongest memories you have from the Holocaust?
The strongest memories?
Yeah.
The strongest memories I have is that what I was holding on to survive. Again, things were happening around me. I could see what's going on. And what gave me encouragement was two things. What gave me encouragement, first of all, was my upbringing that you mentioned before, from a very religious family, and still believe in God, even though the many of some very religious prisoners started questioning God. Is there a God? How could there be a God? And so forth. Mm-hmm. I had no answer to that. Many of them came to me also with the same thing. Why do you still believe? Why do you mention God? And I says, because I says, God will help me. He says, there is no God. I says, maybe I says, this is your opinion, but I'm saying you are giving up. I said, this is my medication. This is the straw that I'm holding on to. If you give up that, then you have nothing left. Then really, there is no use for you to try to fight to survive. But I mean, I was holding up, and I believed that God will eventually, if just we will hold out, God will eventually help me, and I will survive. Yeah.
I'll ask Lily Davidson, who represents the future of a Jewish mother, to ask a question.
Okay.
Hello.
Like Jewish futures. Your mother? You're a mother?
Okay, so my question today is, what was your childhood like before the war, and what were some of the signs that the war was coming?
Will you repeat it, please?
Yes. What was your childhood like before the war, and what were some of the early signs that the war was coming?
Okay. Again, I don't want to go in a lengthy answer, but I could give you a lengthy answer. But the answer is that, first of all, I come from a family, very religious family. And we didn't have any, in those days, of course, there was no television or anything. Radios were available. But we didn't have a radio in our house. And my two sisters, who were older than I, they, of course, went into a very friendly neighbor, and they listened sometimes to the evening news coming through the radio. Of course, all the evening news coming through the Hungarian radio, and later on, there was all propaganda distributing the German propaganda of the big victories that they're having, and so forth. So basically, that was the news that my sisters brought home to us, Plus, they also got two very, very influential magazines compared to like to the Time magazine here in America, which Hungarian magazines, which I was secretly I usually got a hold of it and I went through it because I was not supposed to look into these things. And I learned what goes on in the world. Secondly, the other news was that I was a little boy and we had some refugees coming through that somehow some of them managed to escape, very, very few from Galicia, from Poland, where the worst atrocities were taking place. Kamenets Podolsk, the Dnieper, which is the river in Ukraine, was running red with Jewish blood because there were hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were slaughtered, were machine gunned in open pits in those areas. Some of this news filtered back to us. But I'll tell you, we didn't want to believe it. It was impossible to believe some of the news items that were coming through, that what was going on in Galicia, what was going on in Ukraine, and so forth. And also, there's such a place as Auschwitz. We did not want to believe that. And I'll tell you, I mean, if we would have believed it, probably, I don't know, maybe we would have revolted that at the time when they lined us up to ship us to Auschwitz with instead of telling us that we are going to some Hungarian farms. They, at that time, already, they were very weak. They did not have anymore all of this military strength that they had, let's say, in the 40s and 41, 42, when they occupied Poland and they occupied Russia and so forth. So consequently, I think that eventually, as I was saying, that we already had that news coming through, but we didn't want to believe it. It was very difficult to believe some of the news items that came through. So basically, the two sources of news that I myself and my family were privileged to have, and this is one my sisters brought in the latest news from my neighbor's radio, and also what I gathered in the synagogue and so forth from people that Mr. Joe and Mr. Blow came in and says, have you heard the latest, what's going on, what they do to some Jews over there? And I says, fine, we listened about it. I heard it and I brought home to my parents and I said, you know what, I just heard from so-and-so. And again, they were very sad to hear that, but I don't think that we wanted to believe.
I thought you also got some news in the baths.
In the what?
In the baths, you would.
Oh yeah. Because as a religious boy, we have a bath which religious Jews go every Friday or before a holiday, and in my city there were about 3 of them, in different temperatures and so forth. And I, as a young boy, I like to soak myself in, sometimes there for hours. So I found a corner, and I was sitting in the corner and listening to Yankel Moshe and Feivel, who came in and brought certain news that he just heard, either through the grapevine or we know what I heard, what goes on and over there. And I listened to it, and I finally brought this home, and I started spilling it out to my parents. And they listened very sadly, but they would not tell me that something can be done about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
is there somebody there?
Maybe one more. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for coming and sharing your story. It's incredibly important, especially today. My question to you is, those prisoners who became capos or German helpers, were most of them chosen, or were there some volunteers? And the ones that were volunteers, what were your feelings towards them?
Well, actually, they were chosen. They were chosen sometimes by the Germans, and sometimes they were chosen by other capos and so forth. But I'll tell you, we had a time, by the time of liberation, there was a period of time, at least 3 days, which was no man's land, so to speak. What happened? As I mentioned before, that I looked out with my friends from our bunks in our barracks, and I could see that on the regular guard tower, instead of having a German fellow with a machine gun over there, a German SS officer or Gestapo officer, suddenly I see a civilian with a white band on it. And I turn to my friends and I say, we are just, I said, you wouldn't believe it, but I think that we are now close to liberation. And we have to, and I gave them the signs that right now the civilians are there. Of course, it took about 2 or 3 days after that for the Americans to actually approach our camp and march in with their tanks and their jeeps, so to speak. But till that happened, the Germans left, they started leaving, all the guards started changing into civilian clothing and started leaving. So the minutes when they left, I think they started leaving, there was in about 2 days, there was a time when prisoners started taking revenge on their killers, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And there was a tremendous empty, like a swimming pool area. And I remember I looked into it and it was almost full with all these capos and things. They killed them right and left. I would tell you, I only must tell you one thing. No, I wouldn't say unfortunately, but I would say very few prisoners were able to take revenge. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a real thing, because me and my friends decided when there was this no man's land, so to speak, we were surrounded, our camp in Melk was surrounded by a Luftwaffe barracks, of German Luftwaffe.
The Air Force. The German
Air Force. So we decided that maybe we are going to find some food over there in those barracks, because they all ran away, they all left, it was empty. So we went through one room to the other and picked up every mattress to see maybe something was under it. We picked up a few mattresses and there were guns under the mattresses. So I got a gun and one of my friends got a gun. We all had guns and we put it in. Can you imagine the feeling of a gun? And finally we went out, and as we were standing outside of these barracks, suddenly we see a civilian guy with 2 suitcases marching away, and I said, you know who that guy is? The guy is one of the killers. He killed almost 2 people every day. And finally we stopped him. And he finally says, please, you're making a mistake. And finally he says, we don't make a mistake, we don't. And finally he pleaded for his life. And finally we pointed the gun on him, and my friend says, well, we should really wipe this guy out. And I says, I cannot do it. The other guy says, I cannot do it. All of us couldn't pull the trigger on that killer. Suddenly we see a Russian prisoner that we knew was also in our camp, passes by, and he saw the guns. He was in 7th heaven. He says, can I have the guns? And he also recognized the guy, and he took care of it. So I'm saying that even though the Jews, that's how God created them. We are not killers. We try peacefully to live with other religions. We try peacefully to live with other colors and so forth. But nevertheless, the world doesn't recognize that. In the world today, as you can see in the papers and hear, anti-Semitism is growing, and it's getting stronger any time. And this is partly what I want, but fortunately, I want you to remember as a last note, I want you to remember that we have now a country called Israel. And Israel now says to these killers, wherever they are, Jewish blood is not hefker. Hefker means free anymore. Now you will have to pay a price. So right now we have Israel, thank God, they are taking a prize for everybody that goes out and takes a Jewish life. And this is going to, I think, we have to pray to God that they should get stronger and stronger and be around and get stronger and multiply and so forth. Thank you very much thank you very much to you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you to Rabbi. Where is he? Okay.
Oh, one last question.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
okay, okay.
I was fortunate enough to have been able to read your book, so I'm coming from
Oh,
that
thank you, thank you.
angle. It was very remarkable, and a lot of points stood out. And some of the things among them were moments that was apparent that the people were able to rise above their situation and display their faith. So I was wondering if maybe you could share one or two of those stories. Some of them were during, under the Nazis, and also afterwards when the Americans liberated and they were giving food. There was a very remarkable story there as well about with tefillin. I was wondering if you could share.
Well, as I think I already touched on this briefly before when I mentioned that many times we were approached, especially I was approached. I had a very, very good, I think when I mentioned to you that I had access to fire, that gave me a tremendous advantage. Number one, the biggest problem in the camps, in all these concentration camps, the biggest problem that prisoners suffered initially was dysentery. Dysentery was a tremendous problem. Sometimes it just was unstoppable. Many who got so weak from dysentery they couldn't work anymore. So there was a so-called revier in every camp, which called a hospital. And I don't know of anybody that ever checked in there that ever checked out. I just don't know of anybody. But nevertheless, as a little boy, when I was in my town, my parents were very also friendly with this local druggist. In Eastern Europe, a druggist only sold drugs. He didn't sell any milk and didn't sell any sugar or bread. Every drugstore just strictly was only selling drugs. And I heard him tell my parents a few times that many people who were also suffering from dysentery, not in the camp, that coal dust was a very, very good medication for that. By I mean coal dust is actually, I'll describe it. So I finally heard of so many prisoners came down with this, and I finally talked to the blacksmith, and I says, can you allow me to burn some pieces of wood? And they were flaming hot. I cooled them, I let it cool off, and then I scraped off, I had an aluminum spoon, and I scraped off the powder from the black singe part, burn part. The problem was I didn't have what to put it in. I didn't have what to pack it in. Didn't have any paper, as I said. We didn't have anything. So finally, the blacksmith again gave me a very good idea. He says, "You see that over the little thing growing on a water little water position, some big leaves. So why don't you says, why don't you pick some of these big leaves and you pack it in the leaves, or take a half a leaf and pack that coal dust in." And my friends, I did this. I listened to him, and I distributed it to a lot of the prisoners that were suffering or started to suffer from dysentery, and it helped them a great deal. So that gave me some English and a lot of encouragement. And basically, again, when prisoners came to me and says, "Sruleg, why are you encouraging us to struggle and to survive?" Again, I says, "Look here, I personally believe, even though you may question where is God, if you ever believed in God, where is He? Why can He allow such terrible things happening to us? Why can He allow such atrocities?" And I says, there are times when God is not with us, and so forth. Anyhow, but I still believe that in order for me to survive, I have to believe in Him. And that gave me faith, and that faith helped me to survive.
Would you like to end with a little prayer?
Yes, if I may so. I do have a little prayer that I usually end with, but it's in Hebrew. Is that okay? But also, I will tell you something. If you want to, I may give this prayer, a copy of it to Rabbi, and he eventually might translate it into English. It's a very, very interesting prayer that I found that deals with all those people, all those martyrs that perished in the Shoah, perished in the terrible time of the war. I would like to rise, please, everybody, and I will recite that prayer. El mule rachmim shoichein mamroimim hamtzai menucha nechoina kampi yashchinu v'malos kedoshim et hoirim kezoyer urukia mashirem es nishmeiseyem shel meyois riboy me Yisrael zukein v'nar anushim v'nushim v'tav shenehergu al kiddush Hashem v'shachtu v'nechenku v'nisrefu le'ifer al yedei hatzoyrim hagermanim yemach shemom v'einayim arzei halbunoy nadirei hatoyru kedoyshe b'toyrim rushei yeshivois v'tal mideihem kinoi kois Yisrael sheloi tamu tam chet v'sadikei oilam Rabunai Yisrael em kiloiseyem em kilois hakodesh Oish yemasru nafsham al kadishas Hashem v'chein be'ad koreveinu she'en nisfu b'soicham yizkreim aleheinu l'toivu im shor tzadikei oilam v'yin koim nikmas dam abudav ha'shofech kakuse b'soiras Moshe ish v'elekem haninu goyim amoy kedam abudav yikoim v'kem yashev lefunam v'chiper ad busoy amoy v'al yedei avodei chan liem kusav leimor v'nekesi dumam loy nekesi v'adoinoi shoichein b'tzion v'chesvei HaKodesh nemar lumu yomru hagoyim ay Eloheim yehuda v'agoyim leinenu nikmas dam avodei chashufuch v'ati nafsham tzerurois b'tzroi rachayim lachyoisam b'schias hameisim im kol meiseyam chu Yisrael berachmim v'yishlach lunu es Mashiach tzedkeinu lidois seisunu megoloseinu v'kapseinu yachad me'arba kamfos ha'ores li'artzeinu v'niskei legulo shleimu b'mheiru amen. Thank you very, very much for being here and listening to me. It was a nice evening.